Welcome to another Demarcation Media Dusted Off video. Recreation Part 2 is finally here. And I know I said it before, but this project was so much more involved than I initially thought. It was just huge. You'll see the scale of the project as we look at the editing. We're not going to be looking at the editing real in depth. I'm not going to go like super into the specifics the way I did with the visor glow video. Mostly because the editing for the recreation took over 3 hours, and that's a bit much to sit through. And that would be a bit much for me to explain all of. So we're just going to kind of go through it, watch the whole process. I'll explain kind of the general idea, and we'll look at the final product. The very first step to the whole project was setting up the figures in a way that I could cut them out. As you can see, I went ahead and set up the figures on the white background of the review setup. Just plain light, set up the figures, and took the pictures, and then it was time to drop all of it into Photoshop. Like I said, this editing process took over 3 hours, so I'm not gonna go through all the specifics, but I'll just kind of talk about the general gist of what I did. So the very first phase of the whole thing, aside from taking the photos, was dropping the figures in and cutting them out. I used what was called the object selection tool, and basically it just kind of grabs the biggest object in the picture. And because I took the photo on a white background, it was easy to get the figures out. That doesn't always work sometimes, especially if you're working with lighter color stuff on a white background. It doesn't always select, and it can be a pain, and you have to cut it out by hand. But this time it did work, so that was a huge relief, because that cut a ton of the editing time out. If that hadn't worked, I would have added at least an extra hour and a half. And then it was kind of a puzzle from there. I had to look at the original art and then kind of resize the characters and position them correctly and make sure there was no like extra background stuff, that sort of thing. So that was kind of the first bulk of the project, and it just went on like that for, like I said, the first almost half of the project. I want to say the first half of the editing time was just kind of positioning the figures, making sure they were cut out properly, that sort of thing. So let's just go ahead and watch some of that for a bit. Once all of the figures were positioned, then I had to start working on the background, and that was the difficult part because initially I had wanted to create the halo ring in Mega Construx. I just could not figure out a way to make that work. So I was going to try cutting out the ring that was in the picture, and that didn't really work either. So I just kind of scrapped that idea and was like, I'll come back to the ring later. And then I just had to figure out something to start putting the background together. So I tried a couple different things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. That's just kind of how editing like this goes. You just kind of have to do stuff and then see if it works. But the background was pretty important because that was what was going to tie everything together. And especially because the picture is kind of divided in half into a blue side and an orange side, I had to make sure that I followed that blue on one half and orange on the other half. Otherwise, I would not get anywhere close to the end result that I wanted. It was trial and error for a little bit to get the background or the first layer of the background to look right. I was just kind of blurring here, adding some more color there, taking away some color there, changing the highlights, that sort of thing, until I could get close enough to the original piece of art. And on the original piece of art, it's very indistinct, the background. You just kind of see some hints of what might be space. There's like a planet on one side, and then other than that, it's mostly just a gradient. So that was what I needed, was a gradient that matched the color. So that's what I did using a green background that I had in my library of images. So once I had the general idea of the background, I needed to start blending the figures into it, and I had to do that by actually fading away the bottom half of a lot of them, because on the actual art, there's kind of like mist and dust and whatnot being thrown up into the air and obscuring the feet of most of the characters. So I had to do that a little bit, and then it was fine-tuning their positioning and making sure it looked right according to the original piece. For the Sentinels, it was really a pain at first. I had no idea how I was going to do the Sentinels, and I was thinking I might just resort to using the ones that were in the image originally. But a guy in one of the Discord servers, he goes by Porg, I think, he 3D printed these awesome looking Sentinels that are in scale with Mega, and I think have some connection points that are Mega scale as well. So I asked him for a couple pictures of them, and he sent them to me, and they worked perfectly, and they looked way better than anything I would have come up with by just building bricks. And it looks way better than just copying over the Sentinels from the original piece, because I really didn't want to reuse stuff from the original piece. So I got that in there, and then adding the foreground was the next step, and I used the Mega Constructs rock pieces, like from the old Dragons stuff. I don't know if they use them anymore, but I just kind of took some photos of those at different angles and then dropped them in and just kind of squished them and pulled them and mushed them around however I needed to make them fit the area. So I think I used the same picture like 3 or 4 times, and I just changed the kind of shape and color a bit here and there. And that actually worked way better than I was expecting. I was kind of expecting the flow of the project to get a hiccup there, because I like I said, I really didn't expect it to work as well as it did, but it did. Those rock pieces are great, and it went along. Actually, that was one of the smoothest parts of the whole thing. I had put the background blue and orange, but we needed more because there was more in the pictures. So like I needed a clearer distinction between the blue side and the orange side. So I went ahead and put a shape, just drew a rectangle over top of it and then colored it and then blended it. And that gave me a much more defined line between the two sides, which is exactly what I wanted, but it was a little too dramatic of a shift at first, but that was easily fixed by changing some opacity, and then the final tweaks would be done later when it came to the color grading. Adding in the ring actually turned out to be pretty simple. I just took another rectangle, dropped it in about the right centered area, and then just kind of played with it a little bit and got it to have the proper like curve to it. It took a few tries because I was using the eraser tool at first, and that was not really the best way to do it. But it eventually worked, and then I just kind of chopped up the upper section of it and then used a smear tool, and it looked so good. It really looked like a broken Halo ring in the background, and I didn't have to reuse the one from the actual art. And unfortunately, like I said, I didn't come up with any way to have it in mega form, which kind of is one of the disappointments that I had with the end result. But because it looked good, it's kind of a not a huge disappointment, because like I said, it looked really good. The next kind of big phase of the project was adding all of the effects. So we had the glow from the Hunter's plasma cannon, the light from Chief's AR, the muzzle flare from the CE Magnum, some fire coming out of the Jump Pack Brute's backpack. That all of those things needed to be added in. So if you saw my visor glow video, you essentially know how I did all of this. It's pretty simple, just drawing on the effects and then changing the blending modes and then adding some blur and layering that a couple times to make sure that it looks good. So that was a kind of a tedious process. It was fun, but it was a little bit tedious because I just had to go through and draw it on there and then blur and draw and blur and draw and blur. The parts that were really different were the muzzle flare for the Magnum and the glow on the end of the Hunter's cannon. Both of those were actually separate pictures that I put in and blended. I'll actually do another dusted off about muzzle flares, just a whole video like the visor glow one, talking about muzzle flares, but it's pretty simple. It's just you need a picture of a sparkler or something. So I'll get into that in more detail in another video, but that's what I did for the muzzle flare for the Magnum. And other than that, like I said, most of the rest of the effects were just drawing and blurring, just like the visor glows. the last leg of the whole thing was making sure that my project was kind of organized a little bit, like down on the side where you can see all the layers, just making sure that was somewhat organized. It's kind of organized chaos. And then what I had to do was merge all of the layers together so that I could work with a single image. And if you're ever doing this, you need to copy your layers first. Copy them and then merge the copies, because if the merging doesn't work, then you're gonna have no way to go back and fix it. So once I did that, it was time to start the color grading and trying to get the look of the art itself. I didn't want to try and make it look paint effect, because that would kind of take away from the fact that it's Mega Constructs. But I did want to get the colors to look closer to the actual art. And my dividing line between blue and orange, like I had said before, it was a little too abrupt and sharp. So I had to kind of flatten the image by using like the matte effect and putting in some other effects to make the colors a little less sharp. And then I tried to get the needler to have some glow, and it kind of was working, but it wasn't working quite the way that I wanted to. I also decided to take a little bit of creative liberties and remove all of the kind of needle flying effects and the other like random shots that were just flying around the whole scene. I didn't want to clutter it up, and as it was with all of the way that the figures all fit into the scene, it was a little more chaotic than the original piece. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and not add in any of those extra effects, because it worked for the original piece, but for mine it just was, it was a little too much. And there we go. The project is finished. Here's the first piece of art, the original one. And here is my recreation. Personally, I'm quite proud of how it turned out. It's not perfect. There was no way at all I was going to end up with a perfect result. But when you're making a piece of art like this, especially if you're recreating somebody else's art, you really shouldn't aim for perfect or even exact recreation. Then it's not really your piece of art. So adding your own flair and stylizing it a little bit, I think that's where stuff like this gets really interesting. So like I said before, I decided to keep all the extra like flying lasers and needles out to keep it cleaner. Then the color grading itself is a little different. It's a little bit more flattened than the original piece of art. And that's all my flair to the piece of art. I didn't necessarily create the concept for it, but I can make the recreation my own by having my own twists to it. Next time I try a recreation though, I'm going to give myself a bit more time to plan it before making the video about it. I did not plan this really at all before I made Recreation Part 1, and that was a bit of a mistake. So next time there's going to be a recreation, I'm going to give myself a little more time. But this turned out pretty good. I'd say it was definitely worth the effort. And honestly, I would love to see some other people give their hand at recreating this particular piece of art with Mega Constructs. I've seen one other recreation, and I was using action figures, and that was fantastic. But I would love to see some other Mega Constructs styled recreations of this. If you happen to make one, definitely let me know, because I would love to see that. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.